In the spring of 1929, a farmer named Yan Daocheng and his son were digging a well beside their field in Guanghan, in the Sichuan Basin of southwest China. They wanted water for irrigation. About 1.5 meters down, the shovel stopped against something that was not a rock. It was jade. What they lifted out over the following days was more than 400 pieces of worked jade and stone, discs, blades, ceremonial shapes cut with a precision nobody in that county had a use for. The family sold some of it. Word traveled. In 1934, an American curator named David Graham, running the museum at the West China Union University, came out to dig the site properly and found the edges of something much larger. Then the trail went cold for 50 years. Work stopped, resumed, stopped again, through a period in which excavating in that part of the country was not a priority, and the site kept its shape only as a name in a small number of academic papers. It came back in the summer of 1986, and not through archaeology. Workers at a brick factory were cutting clay out of the ground when they hit a pit packed with bronze. A month later, 20 or 30 meters away, they hit a second one. Between them, the two pits held more than 900 objects in bronze, gold, jade, and ivory, from a civilization that appears in no history book written at the time, in any language, anywhere, and every single object in those pits was broken, not broken by the soil, not crushed by weight. Snapped, hammered, burned, and then laid down in careful layers with elephant tusks stacked over the top of them. We usually approach a vanished civilization by asking what happened to it: war, flood, drought, a conquest that left a burn layer. That is the question we know how to ask, and here it is, the wrong one, because nothing came for these people at all. They did this themselves. We are going to work through 5 parts of this: what is actually in the ground, what was done to it before it went in, why nobody at the site left a sentence explaining any of it, why this was not one afternoon, and then a result published in January of this year which quietly moved the event we are trying to see out of the pit altogether. Number 5. The objects. In November of 2022, Yingfu Li, Tian Chou, Jianbo Guo, and Yunyu Li published a report in the journal Antiquity on the excavation that had been running at Sanxingdui since 2019. It is a dry document. It is also the clearest account in English of one of the strangest deposits in world archaeology. The site sits about 40 kilometers northeast of Chengdu and covers roughly 12 square kilometers, a walled urban center occupied across something like 17 centuries. There is something worth noting about how the new pits were found. After 1986, the obvious thing to do was keep digging outward from the 2 that turned up by accident. That did not happen quickly. More than 30 years passed before systematic survey work in the immediate area around the original 2 pits located the others. In 2019, sitting a matter of meters away, underground that had been walked over, farmed, and studied for 3 decades. 6 new pits were opened, numbered 3 to 8, sitting right beside the 2 the brick workers found. They are rectangular, cut deliberately, ranging from about 3.5 to 20 square meters. The team built enclosed cabins over the pits to hold temperature and humidity steady, put a conservation laboratory on the site itself, excavated in thin horizontal slices of 5 to 10 centimeters, kept every gram of soil, and made a 3-dimensional scan of each slice before cutting the next one. That level of care matters to this story, and we will come back to why. What came out does not look like anything else from Bronze Age China. Bronze heads with flat faces and hard geometric jaws, masks with eyes on stalks, pushed out of the face like telescopes. A bronze figure standing more than 2.5 meters tall on a plinth, hands curled around something that is no longer there. Trees of bronze with birds on the branches. From Pit 3, a kneeling figure carrying a ritual wine vessel on its head, the 2 parts cast separately and welded together, with the weld still visible. From Pit 5 came a mask of gold. It weighs around 280 grams, alloyed with silver at roughly 85% gold, and it is the largest and heaviest gold object known from the entire Shang and Zhou span. Pit 6 held something stranger and much plainer, a wooden chest painted red with cinnabar. The deposits are ordered in Pits 3, 4, 7, and 8. The ivory is on top and the bronze is underneath. That is not how debris falls. That is how a person packs. The ivory deserves a sentence of its own. These are elephant tusks, in quantity, hundreds of them across the pits, laid in dense overlapping layers like thatch. Elephants lived in that basin then? Somebody organized the acquisition of hundreds of tusks, which is not a thing that happens casually, and used them as the closing layer over everything else. More than 13,000 objects came out of the new pits alone. It is worth pausing on how unlike the rest of Bronze Age China this material is. The Shang court on the North China Plain poured its bronze into vessels, cauldrons, wine containers, the equipment of ancestral feasting. Sanxingdui made faces, dozens of them, at life size and above, in a metal that took enormous organization to obtain and cast. Nowhere else in the region was anybody spending that much bronze on the human head. Whatever the belief system here was, it was oriented toward looking, and toward being looked at. Here's the first thing to be honest about. The name Sanxingdui is the name of a modern village. The label Shu comes from Chinese texts composed centuries later by people who were not there. We do not know what these people called themselves, what they called their gods, or what they called the thing in the gold mask. Every name in this episode is ours, not theirs. Which brings us to what was done to all of it. Number 4. The breaking. The condition of the objects is consistent across the pits, and it is not accidental. Bronzes were snapped at the neck and the ankle. Heads were separated from bodies. Faces were struck. Many pieces show heat damage, surfaces scorched, metal warped, ash mixed through the fill. Jade was fractured. Ivory was burnt. Then all of it was placed in a cut rectangular hole, in order and covered. The burning is not an impression formed by looking at scorch marks. In 2023, a study published in the journal Heritage Science measured the color values and the magnetic properties of the pit deposits. Both of those change in specific, measurable ways when soil and its contents have been through fire. The readings confirmed real high-temperature exposure, rather than staining or corrosion doing an impression of it. The fire is established. Hold on to that word established, because in a moment it becomes the most interesting word in this episode. Every element of that sequence takes labor and takes decision. Bronze does not shatter if you drop it. To break a cast bronze head at the neck, somebody has to want it broken and has to work at it. Multiply that by thousands of objects representing what was almost certainly the entire ceremonial wealth of a state, and the scale of the intent becomes hard to look away from. The standard reading is sacrifice, that the pits are the end point of a ritual in which valuable objects were offered by being destroyed, the same way an animal is offered by being killed. Killing an object is a recognizable practice in the archaeological record across many cultures, and it usually means the object is being sent somewhere or taken permanently out of use. There are two serious competing readings, and we should name both. The first is decommissioning. If a temple burned, or a ruler died, or a religious order ended, the sacred equipment attached to it may have had to be retired, and retiring a sacred object often means it cannot simply be stored. It must be destroyed properly and buried properly. The second is conquest, that somebody else came in, smashed the gods of a defeated center, and disposed of them. That reading is weaker on the evidence, because a conqueror looting a city does not usually bury 85% gold in the ground afterwards, but it has not been eliminated. Nobody has established which of these is right. The excavators use the phrase sacrificial pit, and that phrase has hardened into a name through repetition rather than through proof. It is a working label on an open question, and it is worth hearing it that way every time it appears. There's a further complication inside the ritual reading itself. A study published in 2025 examining the newly opened pits together concluded that all of them are best identified as ritual in nature, but flagged that whatever took place around pits 5 and 6 may have been a different act from whatever took place around the others. Different contents, different arrangement, possibly different intention. Even inside the answer everybody uses, the pits are not agreeing with each other. And notice the thing that survives all three interpretations, whichever eventually wins. Somebody in the 12th century before Christ made a decision to convert the most concentrated wealth in the region into fragments. Gold, bronze that had come a long way. Ivory that took a coordinated hunt to gather. In a world where metal was the scarcest strategic resource a state had, they turned it into rubble on purpose and put it out of reach. That is not a moment of panic. Panic buries things whole so it can come back for them. So we have thousands of objects deliberately destroyed by people who owned them, arranged with care by people who valued them. The obvious move is to go and read what they wrote about it. Number 3, the sentence that was never written. There is none. Sanxingdui has produced no documents, no inscriptions, no archive, no dedication, no king list. A small number of incised marks have been noted on objects, a handful of signs, nothing near enough to decipher, and not enough even to establish what language is being represented, or whether a language is being represented at all. A few marks are not a script. They could be ownership marks, foundry marks, counting notches or decoration. With that many samples, no method distinguishes between those possibilities, and the honest position is that we do not know what they are. Think about how little would be needed to change everything here. Not an archive, not a library. One line scratched on one bronze, saying what the object was for or who put it in the ground. Egypt gives us that constantly. Mesopotamia gives us receipts. The Shang give us a king asking his ancestors about the weather. Sanxingdui gives us a 2.5-meter bronze man, holding something we cannot identify and no caption. Set that against what was happening in the same centuries at Anyang on the North China Plain. There, the Shang court wrote on ox bone and turtle shell, and archaeologists have recovered those inscriptions in enormous quantity. Because of them, we have Shang kings by name. We have the questions they put to their ancestors about harvests, about childbirth, about whether to go to war this month, and, in many cases, the answers recorded afterwards. An entire ruling house speaks to us directly. 40 kilometers from Chengdu, at a center casting bronze at a level nobody in that region had reached before, the record is silent. Not damaged, not lost, silent. The consequence is total, and it is easy to say too quickly. We cannot name one person who lived here, not a ruler, not a priest, not the caster who welded that kneeling figure to its vessel and left the seam showing. We do not know how the place was governed, whether power passed by blood, what the masks represented, or whether the enormous standing figure was a god, a king, a priest, or a piece of furniture for holding something else. The written descriptions of an ancient Shu kingdom that do exist in Chinese literature were compiled more than 1,000 years after these pits were sealed, by authors working from legend and distance, and they cannot be used to caption the objects in front of us. Doing that anyway is one of the commonest errors in popular accounts of this site. The honesty required here is important. Absence of surviving writing is not proof of a people who could not write. Later graves in the same broad region contain seals, which is normally the mark of a society keeping records of some kind. And records kept on bamboo, wood, silk, or hide in a humid basin would leave nothing behind in 3,000 years. It is entirely possible these people wrote constantly and that every word of it rotted. We cannot distinguish a culture without writing from a culture whose writing was made of plants. What we can say is what that means for the question we actually care about. The physical evidence tells us what was done with great precision. The reason lives in somebody's head in the 12th century before Christ, and there is no mechanism by which it reaches us. That is a harder kind of loss than a burnt library. A burnt library at least once had the sentence in it. And it gets more difficult because the one thing everybody assumes about these pits, that they record a single moment, turns out not to hold either. Number 2, not one afternoon. The picture almost everyone carries is a kingdom in crisis on one particular day, gathering its holy objects, destroying them together, and putting them in the ground before something arrives. It is a good image. The dating does not support it. More than 100 samples were taken for radiocarbon work during the new excavation. 6 results, all from Pit 4, were available at the time of the antiquity report, and they place that pit between roughly 1260 and 924 years before Christ. That is a window of more than 3 centuries on a single feature, which tells us how much caution the chronology still needs. Read together with the objects themselves, the excavators Ran Honglin and colleagues set out a sequence rather than an event. Pits 1 to 4, 7, and 8 sit broadly in the final phase of the Anyang period, somewhere around 1200 to 1000 before Christ. Pits 5 and 6 look later, probably early Western Zhou, roughly 1046 to 950 before Christ. Follow what that means. If those dates hold, the pit containing the great gold mask was dug after the Shang dynasty had already fallen, generations after the first pits were closed. This was not a single night of burial. It was a practice, something that a community did, stopped doing, and did again, across a span longer than the United States has existed. The objects are not uniform in origin either. In 2025, a study in the Journal of Archaeological Science examined 39 casting cores. The clay left inside a bronze after it is cast, which carries the fingerprint of the workshop that made it. The samples came from pits 1 and 2. The non-vessel bronzes, the heads and masks and figures, were consistent with local casting near Sanxingdui. The vessels were not those pointed toward the middle and lower Yangtze, hundreds of kilometers away. So some of what was destroyed here was made here, and some of it arrived through a trade network before being broken. That matters for the conquest theory and for the isolation theory at the same time. These were not a sealed-off people producing alien objects in a vacuum. They were connected, trading upriver and down, receiving goods from a region hundreds of kilometers away, and then doing something to those goods that nobody downstream appears to have done. There is one more thing the timeline does to the story everybody tells. Roughly 40 kilometers to the southwest, a site called Jinsha rises to prominence. Not long after Sanxingdui declines, and much of the same vocabulary shows up in it. Goldwork, ivory, jade in familiar forms, bird motifs. The style is simpler and the scale is smaller, but the family resemblance is not in dispute among the people who work on both, which means the ending everyone reaches for is probably wrong as well. Sanxingdui does not look like a civilization that was wiped out. It looks like one that closed a place down and continued somewhere else. We should hold that lightly. 39 cores is a small sample from 2 pits out of 8, and provenance work of this kind gives probabilities, not certificates. Still, the shape of the thing changes, not one event, not one workshop, not one generation, which leaves the fire. Everything in these pits passed through burning, and burning is an event with a location. Find where the fire was, and you're standing where the ceremony happened. So where was it? Number 1. The fire that was somewhere else. In January of 2026, a team led by Juna Zhang, working with the excavation director Ran Honglin and the geoarchaeologist Zhengkai Xia of Peking University, published a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science with a title that puts the whole field on notice. Sacrificial pit or not, they took pit 4 apart as a piece of ground rather than as a container of treasure. This is where the excavation method from earlier pays off. Because the soil was kept, sliced thin, and recorded, there was something left to analyze. The team measured magnetic susceptibility through the fill, which changes when soil has been heated. They measured color values, which shift in a predictable way with fire. They ran elemental analysis and infrared spectroscopy on the residues. And then they did the thing that settles arguments of this kind. They cut intact blocks out of the deposit without breaking them up, set those blocks in resin, and ground them down into slides thin enough for light to pass through. Under a microscope, a slide like that shows the deposit still standing in its original arrangement. Every particle where it came to rest, at the angle it came to rest. It is the difference between reading a paragraph and reading the same paragraph after somebody has put it through a blender. Micromorphology is how you tell whether ash settled where it burned or was tipped in from a bucket. If a fire burns in a pit, that pit carries specific signatures. The base and walls are heated in place. Magnetic and color changes concentrate downward toward the floor and fade with distance. Ash sits where it fell, layered and undisturbed, with the fuel structures still oriented the way they burned. Pit 4 does not show that. The combustion residues in it were not produced by burning inside the pit. They were made somewhere else and brought in. Sit with what that removes. The pit is not the site of the ceremony, it is the place the results of the ceremony were carried to and filed. Whatever was done, the fire, the smashing, whatever was said or sung or decided while it happened occurred at some other location, and that location has not been found. The one event this entire site exists to record left no address. Picture the sequence that this forces. A fire is built somewhere out of view of every excavation trench ever cut here. Objects that took years of collective labor go into it. They come out broken and blackened, and then people gather up the ash. The ash specifically along with the fragments, carry it across open ground, and pour it into a rectangular hole that has been prepared in advance. The pit is the last step of a procedure with earlier steps, and the earlier steps are the ones that carried the meaning. The site covers about 12 square kilometers. The excavated portion is a small fraction of that. The burning ground may still be there, under a field, waiting for a trench to fall in the right place. It may also have been an ordinary open surface that left nothing recoverable at all, in which case there is no trench that would ever find it. The same excavation recovered plant textile remains in the ash layer of Pit 4, identified through phytolith analysis as mainly bamboo. Something woven from bamboo went into the fire with the bronze. Whether that was a container, a mat, a wrapping, or an offering in its own right, nobody can currently say. And it reaches backwards through everything else in this episode. The layering, the ordered ivory over ordered bronze, the pit walls cut square, all of that is now clearly the tidy end of the process rather than the process. We have been studying the filing in extraordinary detail for 40 years. The event itself was never in the box. 2 things must be said against overreading this. The finding is about Pit 4. It does not automatically transfer to the other 7, each of which has its own fill and its own history, and the pits are already known to differ from one another in date and contents. And it is one paper recent, using a combination of methods that will need to be run on the neighboring pits before the conclusion can be called settled. A careful viewer should hold it as the best current reading of one pit, not as a verdict on the site. But notice the direction of travel because it is the point of this whole episode. Every instrument we have pointed at Sanxingdui in the past 5 years has made our knowledge more precise and our understanding no closer. We can now date a pit to a window. We can tell which bronzes were cast locally and which came upriver. We can tell that the fire was not lit where the ash ended up. Each of those is real, hard-won, checkable knowledge. Not one of them touches the question everybody actually has, which is why a wealthy, skilled, functioning society took everything it held sacred, destroyed it methodically, and buried it in a rectangle in the ground. What would close the gap is not a better microscope. It is a find of a completely different kind. A burning ground with structures around it, a deposit of organic material that happens to have survived, an inscription somewhere in the 12 square kilometers nobody has opened yet. Those are possible. They are also not the sort of thing that arrives because a research program is well-funded and well-run. This one is already both. We are getting extremely good at reading a room the ceremony had already left. Nothing here is missing in the way we normally mean it. The objects were not looted or lost at sea or carried off to some other museum. 60,000 and more of them have been recovered, cataloged, conserved, scanned, and put behind glass. The site was not leveled by an enemy. The soil was not destroyed by careless digging. This excavation is one of the most controlled ever run anywhere. By every measure we usually apply, the record here is in excellent condition. And it will not answer. That is worth carrying, because it marks the edge of what evidence can do. Objects record actions. They are very good at it, and the better our instruments get, the more detail we pull out of them. But objects do not record reasons. A reason has to be spoken or written by somebody who held it, and preserved by somebody who thought it mattered, and at Sanxingdui that chain was never started. Or it was started on bamboo and the basin ate it. It is a strange thing to be told by a site this rich. Sanxingdui is not stingy. It has handed over gold, bronze, jade, ivory, textile fibers, radiocarbon dates, clay cores that name a river system, and a soil column detailed enough to prove where a fire was not. Almost every question anybody has thought to ask of the material has answered. It answered them faster in the last 5 years than in the previous 50. The one question it has never answered is the only one anybody came for. We tend to assume that any question will eventually fall to a good enough instrument. Most of the losses we chase really are like that. Some are not. Some things were not taken from us at all. They were simply never set down by people who had no reason to imagine anybody would one day be standing over their gods with a microscope trying to work out what they meant. Yan Daocheng was digging a well. He was looking for water, and he found the edge of the largest unanswered question in Chinese archaeology, and he had no idea, almost a century later, we are still standing at the same edge with much better tools. If you want to see more of what the record keeps hidden, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.